Well, welcome back. I hope that you had a chance over the break to look at the international report card presentations. Lots of exciting detail there. As was mentioned earlier, detailed results from each country's report card are included in a special supplement to the Journal of Physical Activity and Health, which was just released this morning and is available on open access. So please take advantage of that opportunity. I should also mention that we're very honored to have Dr. Robert Malina as editor of the Special Journal Supplement. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Malina to you. Bob is a professor emeritus in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Education of the University of Texas at Austin, and a research professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Tarleton State University in Stephenville, Texas. His primary area of interest is in the biological growth and maturation of children and adolescents, with a particular focus on motor development and performance, youth sports, youth athletes, and the potential influences of physical activity and training for sport. A related area of interest is the growth, nutritional status, performance, and physical activity of school-aged children in Oaxaca, southern Mexico. This research project began in 1968 and continues to today. He is a highly accomplished and well-respected researcher and advocate for childhood physical activity. Over the next hour, he will facilitate a panel discussion featuring the principal investigators from 5 countries covering 5 continents to explore insights from these global comparisons and challenge conventional thinking and stimulate creative and innovative strategies to improve the grade in each of your countries and across the globe. Dr. Malina.
Thank you very much, Angelo, for that kind introduction. And it indeed was an honor to serve as the guest editor for the special issue of the journal. I must admit, I called on many friends, and I probably burnt many bridges to get the reviews in a very, very timely manner. In the next hour or so, I was asked to lead a discussion of issues related to global comparisons of physical activity and inactivity across many parts of the world. We have 5 of the authors of the presentations here, and I would like to, at this moment, give each one of them a few seconds to introduce themselves and tell which country you represent and so on. Vincent.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Vincent Onywera. I represent Kenya. I'm from Kenyatta University in the Department of Recreation Management and Exercise Science. But I also double up as the registrar in charge of research, innovation, and outreach at the university. I'm a co-founder and chairman of Healthy Active Kids Kenya. Thank you.
Silvia, please.
My name is Silvia Gonzalez. I am from Colombia. Currently, I am working with Universidad de los Andes. I am the project manager at the group of epidemiology in the School of Medicine in that university. And I coordinated the development of the report card in Colombia.
Good morning. My name is Grant Tomkinson. I'm from the Health and Use of Time group at the School of Health Sciences at the University of South Australia. And I'm just really the person sitting up on stage for Australia. I was one of a constellation of people, physical activity experts and researchers from Australia who were able to put together the Australian report card.
Good morning. I'm John Reilly from the Physical Activity for Health group at the University of Strathclyde, which is in Glasgow in Scotland. I led on the development and publication of the Scottish card. There are copies, hopefully, by the poster in the other room. If anyone wants a hard copy, I brought a large suitcase of hard copies of the Scottish card to give away. I don't want to take them back. So please see me at the end if anyone would like a hard copy of the Scottish card. I think I'm kind of the representative for Europe here as well, which has a nice ring to it. Thank you.
I'm Peter Katzmarzyk from the Pennington Biomedical Research Center in the United States, and I had the honor of chairing the report card committee for the United States, which was released under the auspices of the National Physical Activity Plan Alliance in the U.S.
Thank you very much. The protocol for the next hour or so is the following. We would like to address questions to the panel for about 35 or 30 minutes or so, and then open the floor to questions for the remainder of the period. Mark has given me a list of questions of interest to him. I've developed a series of semi-questions, semi-commentary that are more interesting to me. So we will try to balance the books. And I will offer the question in general, and then we'll let one of you take the lead with the potential answer. One of the first questions was, how might countries, including your respective countries, which represent 5 different geographic areas of the world, use the findings from the global matrix to initiate efforts to enhance physical activity among youngsters and decrease sedentary behaviors? Grant, we'll begin with you. You're in the middle.
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do at a national level is we need to get a national surveillance system, and we need to agree on a standardised set of indicators, also the metrics, and then the operationalisation, so how we're going to measure those metrics. And where possible, have a core set that are globally standardised, using the framework that we've got already from the global matrix. And if we have these global report cards over time that can help with these valid measures, it helps put pressure on those lagging countries. But we also need a multi-level approach in Australia. We need the governments talking with the communities, with the schools and with the households. So we really need to take that approach in the first instance.
Silvia?
Okay, in Colombia, we see the global matrix as an opportunity to identify those countries that are succeeding, maybe in those indicators that we need to improve. So we think it's an opportunity to recognize other countries' efforts and maybe learn of those strategies that have conducted them to succeed, and to see at what extent can we apply those strategies or initiatives in our country, considering our context and maybe some similar characteristics that we must have with the other countries.
John?
Well, we published the Scottish card in October of last year, and I think it's been useful in a number of ways, but the Scottish card in itself, where, for example, we produced F grades for the 2 kind of headline indicators. So we graded F on overall physical activity, and we graded F on sedentary behaviour, screen time. So that had some impact. It was obviously useful to highlight that in a Scottish context. Where I'm hoping that the global card might help us is in the business of comparisons. I think that the impact of some of those really poor grades, we failed on most of the grades. It's helpful to illustrate the grade in a Scottish context, but it's probably more helpful in terms of getting action to compare with other countries. I think politicians and policymakers are quite sensitive to those sorts of comparisons. So it's not just that we're doing badly, but where we're doing badly in relation to other countries, that might be a useful driver for improving the situation. I haven't had much chance to speak to Martin Standage yet, who's led on the English card, but Scotland's always very concerned about where we lie in relation to England, and it might be useful to see what we can learn from that this week, take that home and use it as a driver for change. But I do think the business of comparisons, the business of almost embarrassing Scottish government, Scottish policymakers at local and national level may be useful, and that's what I want to take from this meeting.
I think that's a good point you make, John. We could move on, I think, to a related issue, the imbalance between infrastructure and activity. The countries with better infrastructures seemingly have a much higher level of physical inactivity among youngsters. Now, it's largely, it may be a political game, maybe nurturing the people game to get reelected, but I think that's an issue that we need further discussion. Do you want to touch on that, John?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's an important point. I think it's been one of the things that's been obvious after the release of the Scottish card is that I've had a lot more contact with policymakers and politicians than I normally have. I'm not entirely sure that's a good thing, but let's hope some good might come of it. But I think the approach they tend to take is the assumption that if the infrastructure is in place, so for example, if PE is right in their mind, then everything else must be right and it must fall into place. They've kind of compartmentalized that. If we deal with PE policy, for example, we've dealt with physical activity. I think one of the lessons from the global card, which was very clear from the presentation this morning, is that that's not enough. You know, it needs a much more kind of integrated, holistic approach. And you know, overall physical activity is a function of a number of different domains, and we have to get all of the domains right. But I think our politicians, our policymakers have tended to focus individually on specific domains, assume that they're right. In some cases, they may be right, but then assume that that's enough, and that's probably not enough.
Good point. Vincent, I would like to let you address that because you seem to be working in a little bit different context.
Thank you. This global matrix for us in Kenya provides us with a mirror to be able to examine ourselves. Kenya is a country that is at the beginning of the physical activity and nutrition transition. And indeed, most countries in Africa are in the same situation. So through this global matrix, we are able to appreciate our history. We are able to know where we are coming from so as to be able to understand where we are and where we would like to go to. Through this global matrix, we are able to benchmark, to learn the lessons and experiences from other countries so that we can be able to try and implement in a mutually beneficial manner what has worked elsewhere without interfering with what is working back at home. So through this matrix, we are able to look at our past so as to perfect our present and be able to predict our future moving forward. We appreciate as a country that we don't know everything in the realm of healthy, active living, but we also say that we know enough to act. So through this meeting and the global matrix, I think we are on the right track.
Peter, now in the US, we seem to have a major break between infrastructure and activity. And what are your main thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and I agree with Mark. We very much follow the Canadian model where we have beautiful parks, we have beautiful infrastructure, but you could take a drive on any given Sunday and these parks are empty. So we really need to work on programming and improving access to those parks. Now, you know, much of the United States is moving towards more suburbanization. You know, we live in suburbs and we live in, as Bob was mentioning earlier, we don't have neighborhoods. We have, you know, a suburb where we live. And so there's usually not a school within your neighborhood anymore. There may be some parks and some sidewalks, which is great. But, you know, we need to move back to that more integrated model. You know, for my own children, they live 12 miles from their school down an interstate. So it's very difficult to walk to school in that type of environment.
Okay, now let's touch on physical inactivity. This one always intrigues me for the simple reason that most physical inactivities or sedentary behaviors are highly valued by most societies. School, study, reading, television viewing, and so on. And moreover, we highly value motorized transport. How do you perceive in your respective countries that we can break, you might say, this grip of physical inactivity in a society where these things are so highly valued to let youngsters be youngsters and enjoy childhood and the physical activity of childhood? Silvia, would you like to take a start?
Okay, I think that in Colombia, for example, we need to start from recognizing guidelines to reduce sedentary behaviors, because we already recognize physical activity as a vital strategy to prevent non-communicable diseases, but we are like forgetting that we must do something to reduce the time that our children and as adults are expending in sedentary behaviors. So it is, we have a broad amount of evidence worldwide to take like the initiative to do something about that. We have some other guidelines from other countries that we can adapt or adjust to our context. But we must start by being a good role model as adults for our children.
Grant?
I think the first thing to say is we're not going to be able to turn back time. So we're not going to be able to go back to when I was a child in the 1980s or when my parents were children in the 1950s and have environments like this. So electronic screen time, these mobile devices are things of the present and also the future. So it's going to be very difficult to break. What we need to do is need to be able to integrate that and think of innovative ways in which people can be active, potentially using those devices to increase physical activity. One of the things that I'm a big advocate of, and I don't know a whole lot about the research underlying it necessarily, but I think there's some merit in trying to get children to snack on physical activity. You know, from my standpoint, if I want to get a physical activity dose or try to be active throughout the day, I take a very structured approach. So it's very an exercise approach. I take the time to systematically decide when I'm going to do it, how am I going to go about it. But children live in a very unstructured world and they tend to be very intermittent in nature. So I think if we can promote this snacking on physical activity, that they can get it in bite-sized chunks, I think that'll be really good to trying to turn that tide around. And it may not have any benefits, any additional benefits to their cardiovascular, their bone, their mental, cognitive, or even academic performance and health, but I think it might help them adhere and comply to the guidelines better. So I'd be promoting trying to snack on physical activity, trying to get it whenever you can to try to break that sedentary cycle through maybe things like active lesson breaks or getting up and moving about a few times for a few minutes every couple of hours.
You raised a very important point. If I may diverge a second. My wife was a middle school mathematics teacher, and in elementary school math, they use manipulatives. But the things they manipulate are incredibly small. And I once proposed, why do they not manipulate big blocks? Make a physically active classroom out of teaching mathematics. It can be done with little creativity. John, how about your thoughts on breaking the sedentary behavior cycle?
I think one of the things which became clearer to me than it was when we were developing the Scottish card, and then since the release of the Scottish card, has been the need to be quite clear about the messages as well. So in an academic audience like this, we tend to talk about sedentary behaviour and different components, different domains of sedentary behaviour. It's been fairly clear when trying to get the message across to non-academic audiences that in Scotland at least there's been a bit of a lack of clarity about the message, so that the message we want to get across mainly is about screen time and the hazards of screen time, the fact that Scottish children and adolescents are spending way too much time in front of screens, and that's recreational screen time. We've had a bit of trouble getting the message across that it's recreational screen time that we want to tackle. Some of the confusion has arisen, maybe because we've not been very clear in our messaging about that being mixed with academic sedentary time or other forms of sedentary time. So we consistently come up against people thinking about, we're talking about screen time, which is recreational, which is harmful at the levels that children and adolescents are exposed, and which is probably socially patterned as well. But the message seems to be heard as we're talking about reading. We might harm reading, or we might harm, less sedentary time might mean less time in front of the teacher sitting quietly at school and so on. So I would say one of the lessons of the Scottish card has been to be a bit clearer about what we mean. We mean anyway screen time. Screen time was graded F in the Scottish card, and really focus on screen time and not allow that kind of mixed message. The other issue I think is that in a Scottish context, and as you heard this morning in the context of a number of other Western countries, The policies around many of these key behaviours are actually pretty good. So in Scotland, for example, policies around most of the behaviours in the card are actually either good or very good, at least at national level. I think we have problems with implementation and evaluation, but the policies themselves at national level are very good. The one major exception to that was on screen time, so it's a glaring gap that in a Scottish context, we're a very good national policy across the whole card, really all the behaviours in the card, but we have nothing to say in policy terms about screen time. It just doesn't feature at the moment. So I think getting it on the agenda and being clear about what we mean and being clear about the harms that it might do is something that we need to do more and do better.
Peter?
As Dr. Malina mentioned, we really have a focus on sedentary behavior, and taking the school as an example, that we really are almost forcing our children to sit in these classes all day, and the argument is always around standardized tests. Especially in Louisiana, where I'm from, everything revolves around these LEAP tests. Standardized tests are given, in each of the grades, and the focus is on mathematics and English and science and these sorts of things. And anything that takes away from that, the teachers don't want to hear about it. So although they have a mandated physical activity course or physical education, many times these classes are canceled because they're doing the standardized tests or they're preparing for the standardized tests. So we really need to get the message across, and we do the best we can, that if kids are physically active and they're physically fit, they actually do better on these standardized tests. And so whenever we talk to people in education, that's the message. We keep hammering on that actually, if you spent more time on physical activity, your tests would probably improve. Other options we've been discussing is whether we should be including a physical literacy or a physical fitness component on these tests. That way the schools will be forced to handle it and actually incorporate physical activity into their curriculum more than they do now.
Vincent?
Thank you very much. I think for us in Kenya, we would like to encourage physical activity as part and parcel of life. Secondly, we have realized situations where physical activity is used as a punishment, especially in schools. When a child does not get the right answer in the classroom, they are asked to run around the block or to do a few press-ups. Eventually, these children internalize and associate physical activity with punishment. So we have been and we keep on talking about the need to look at physical activity as part and parcel of our lifestyle. Two, we would like to break the silo mentality where we are talking to ourselves every day. We want to really encourage and inculcate a robust intersectoral approach as a country so that everybody, including those who are not within the realm of physical activity or active healthy living, should come on a round table so that we talk to each other instead of talking at each other. Then number three, we really feel as a country, that we need guidelines, because what gets measured gets done. Guidelines for physical activity. And one thing I have noted over time is that in most guidelines, we say children should accumulate at least 60 minutes of this and that. We think as a country, we want to replace the word at least with the word over, because when you tell these people to accumulate at least, the norm is that they will go up to that threshold and then they stop. We are saying as Kenya, and I think indeed Africa, we want to say children should accumulate over so that we focus on more rather than on less. And moving forward, through collaborations and meetings such as these ones, I believe that the African continent would be able to run and to run fast in this area. Thank you.
But you touched on an important point about the 60 minutes. So the point I think that merits concern is perceptions of guidelines. All too often, I think people say, oh, 60 minutes, I'll stop there. What are your thoughts about making guidelines more flexible? Because we know from individual differences, not everybody needs 60 minutes. Some people may need 90 or 120 minutes. Peter, why don't we begin with you? Give me your thoughts on, share your thoughts from all the research at Pennington going on.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Certainly, the physical activity guidelines in Canada, used to really emphasize increasing physical activity, decreasing sedentary behavior from where you are now. And I think that's a very innovative approach where not just targeting 60 minutes, saying we need to do 60 minutes more based from your baseline. Because to be honest, the physical activity guidelines have always been kind of based on this, built upon a background level of physical activity. So in adults, for example, we say 30 minutes of physical activity every day. Well, this was always upon a baseline level of physical activity, activities of daily living and light activity and all these sorts of things. But this was, 30, 40, 50 years ago when all that research evidence was accumulated when the prospective cohort studies were done. But what's happened over time, our activities of daily living and this incidental activity has come down. But we're still saying 30 minutes of physical activity, just like we're saying 60 minutes of activity in children. However, the background level of activity, as we've seen in many studies, it is eroded over time. So just to say 60 minutes or 30 minutes, it doesn't get you very far. We have to add that on a baseline level of activity, which has also gone down. So again, we need to reevaluate the evidence that we have in terms of physical activity and physical activity for health. So now, many of the new cohort studies are incorporating accelerometry and other objective measures of physical activity so we can get a better sense of 24-hour levels of activity, not just what was answered on a questionnaire 30 years ago, and to see how that's related to health. Because it's still very much a moving target. In my opinion, I think 60 minutes is definitely too low. If it was just 60 minutes, that's not enough activity.
Now, the guidelines are there. Now, are there differences in perceptions of guidelines across countries? Grant, would you like to take or John, why don't you start there?
Yeah, just following on from that, I mean, my impression, I don't have any great evidence for this, but my impression among people who are aware of the 60-minute guideline for school-aged children and adolescents is they tend to think, as Vincent said, it's a target, not really a minimum. I think that's, again, a slight difficulty with the messaging. On the other hand, I have another difficulty, which is that we're so far away from even the 60 minutes that, setting a higher target, even if the evidence led us to a higher target, might be potentially counterproductive. We have to be quite careful about how we message that as well. I don't know how many of you in the audience read about the study on fruit and vegetable intake from UK dietary surveys. This was about 3 months ago, I think around about February. So based on UK dietary surveys of fruit and vegetable intake, so associations between fruit and vegetable intake and various health outcomes look graded and progressive, well above the 5 a day. So it almost looks as though there are benefits well above the 5 a day recommended. And that's a single study. I'm not suggesting we should get carried away, but I think the problem is that was seen as really being very negative, at least in the UK. There was a public debate about should it be 8 a day, should it be 10 a day, when in fact, consumption in Scotland particularly is way below the 5 a day. So I think there are some dangers in messaging where the evidence might lead us to a target which is further and further away from reality. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think we have to be a bit careful how we do it.
Grant?
In Australia, for example, a couple of months ago, certainly earlier this year, there was the release of the new guidelines for physical activity and sedentary behaviour for children, young people and adults. And they were sort of 2 and 3 years in the making. And I don't think there's good public awareness around those guidelines in the first instance. So we need to have national messaging campaigns to try to get that message out. And so while we're trying to get people to accumulate at least 60 minutes, that 60 minutes is for those minimal health benefits. And while more is better, I take John's point, there is a certain point where there's this cost-benefit trade-off that if we do too much, it could start to be harmful. I certainly want that message to get out that we need to accumulate at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every day. I don't think people are out there, the general public in Australia really know about it. I think people need to take ownership of it from a number of different levels. The government needs to take ownership of it, the schools, the community, and even the individuals themselves need to take ownership of it. And I think there needs to be a bit more of a push towards the benefits of physical activity beyond weight management. I think there's a bit of a link between physical activity and weight management that has been pushed in the past, and we need to start focusing on the cardiovascular, the bone, the mental, and the cognitive health benefits for physical activity and try to promote that message.
Thank you. And Silvia?
Okay, in Colombia we have had a good experience with guidelines, but maybe the fact that Vincent was mentioning about vocabulary, that people sometimes is like, okay, I achieved the 30 minutes or the 150 minutes in the week, or in children the hour, that's enough. I'm not going to do anything else. So I think it will be very positive to do a change in the vocabulary that we are using. Another thing that we are seeing is that maybe we can deepen in the conditions that we want to promote for physical activities, not just like completing the amount of minutes, but how. In Colombia, we have seen that most of adults are meeting physical activity recommendations for transport. So that is good, but we would like that people do physical activity because of a healthy choice, because of a lifestyle choice, more than a necessity or sometimes a need that is related to poverty.
Thank you. Peter?
I just wanted to comment a little bit on the attainability of these targets of 60 minutes a day. So by show of hands out there right now, how many of you think that 60 minutes a day is something that can be attained in our children and youth? And quite a few. Now, how many do not think it's achievable? Wow, no hands. Oh, there's one over here. Always one. Well, you know, when we think about that and people say, wow, 60 minutes a day is a lot. Well, based on objective accelerometry data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the US, you know, 25% of kids are meeting that guideline. And so that actually resulted in a D- for overall physical activity. But when you think about it and turn it around, the fact that 25% of kids can actually meet that means that it is attainable. It's not something that, you know, 2% or 3% can do. You know, 25% of our kids are actually hitting 60 minutes a day. So I think that kind of speaks to the idea that it is an attainable target, and it seems like the vast majority of people here think that that is achievable. So I think we're kind of on target with that.
Right.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. We got a D- for overall physical activity as well, and we get about a quarter of our children achieving 60 minutes every single day, certainly primary and secondary school children. About a quarter of our preschool children aged 2 to 4 get at least 180 minutes. But on top of that, on average, Australian primary and secondary school children achieve the 60-minute target on 4 to 5 days a week. So they can get it on most days, they're just not getting it on every single day. So we're almost there, just not quite.
Good point. All right, we're running out of time, and this is going to be the last question for the group before we open up to the audience. How transferable do you believe the observations in different countries are across countries? Or how can we help our countries help each other strengthen those they're not doing well at, and so on? Vincent, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I think there are different lessons that can be transferred, say, to developing countries, to Africa, to Kenya, while there are some which needs to be repackaged so as to be effective on the ground, to be acceptable, because Kenya, for example, is a country that is faced with a a double-edged sword. At one end of the spectrum, we have people who are, going through famine, they are hungry, they are stunted, they are underweight. While at the other end of the spectrum, we have people who have more than enough. So depending on which part of the country or which group you are addressing, messages will be different. Number two, there are certain lessons. For example, we are just talking about the guidelines. This is something that is actually transferable and is doable. The other thing is a strong advocacy. I've seen that there's very strong advocacy in some of the countries that are representing in the global matrix. So we as a country would like to focus on solutions rather than excuses. And these solutions, really, we cannot achieve them without looking at how other countries across the globe have succeeded in, for example, the various indicators outlined in the report card.
Okay, we'll try John to make these to the point so we could get the audience involved.
Yeah, so I mean, I think probably two things for me in terms of transferability or generalizability. One, I would think broadly that the findings from the other Western countries are at least potentially generalizable to the Scottish context, for example. Obviously, it needs some discussion. It'd be useful to see, for example, it looks on the face of it like New Zealand might be a model which may have more lessons for us than others. How are New Zealanders doing it? How have they achieved what they've achieved, perhaps? So those sorts of questions might be helpful. But also, the other issue of transferability, I think one of the themes of Mark's presentation this morning was really the idea that if you build it, they won't come. It's not just about community and built environment, or not just about policy. It's something about reclaiming activity going on as part of normal life for children, going on throughout the day, every day as part of normal life. And that's perhaps the lesson which I would hope would be transferable from the non-Western countries in the card to the Western countries. How we do that, I don't know. We could probably discuss that for several weeks or months or years, but maybe that's the other lesson that may be transferable, that we have to kind of reclaim children's lives beyond the community and built environment and policy.
Good point. Peter?
Well, I think there's great power in the global matrix and understanding the different contexts of what's going on in the different countries. And one of Mark's slides he showed was that we need further research on the correlates and the determinants of physical activity in these different environments. And I think that's extremely important. If we want to take an intervention that was developed in one country and now try it in another country, it's going to need to be adapted and culturally adapted and adapted to that context. So it's not just within the cross countries, it's also within countries. The way that we may approach a situation out in rural Saskatchewan would be very different than we'd approach it in downtown Toronto. And in our research in Louisiana, we're a very, very rural state. There's about 4 million people across the entire state of Louisiana. It's very rural. And much of what we understand about the built environment and effects on physical activity, these come from suburban and urban studies. We don't know how to measure the built environment in rural settings or what the impact is on physical activity. So I think going across this matrix, Louisiana may have more in common with Kenya or Ghana or other countries than they actually do with other parts of the United States. So I think there's great potential in transferring what we're learning to different environments.
Grant?
I think the determinants of physical activity are multi-level. So on one hand, with differences in cultures, structures of government, different expectations, makes transferability a little bit difficult. For example, we are like a number of the Western nations that do really well with the structures. We've got the structures, but we're just performing badly in terms of overall physical activity levels. But we seem to have a fairly unique perspective in that we do really well in sport, in organised sport, and our sports participation, while high, it evokes a sense of national pride in our country. And international sports success is the #1 indicator in Australia of national pride above arts and sciences. So when we do well, sort of lifts the nation, and I think we rest on our laurels a little bit. We look at it and we say, we are a sporting nation, therefore we are active. But we're not. And one thing that's going to come out from the global matrix and in a few hours in the Australian media is that New Zealand absolutely smashes when it comes to physical activity behaviours. And we don't like that. We don't like losing to New Zealand at any point in time. And we're going to have to learn some lessons, some hard, cold lessons, and it's going to be a bit of a smack in the face to the people over there, and the government isn't going to like it, and it's probably going to be some good fuel for what we need to do next. So we might be able to learn some lessons from our closest neighbour across the ditch, but outside of that, I'm not sure.
Good point. Very good. Well, we could get back to sport later. Silvia, you got the final word before we open the floor.
Okay, when we are talking about global challenge like the crisis of physical inactivity in children, I think we have a lot to learn, and we can always learn from other countries' experiences and efforts, because we are starting from a common concerning. So we think that we may have substantial differences between countries, but we also have some similar characteristics that may allow us to apply some of the lessons that other countries had in different extents. So I think as we can learn from other countries, we can share our experiences too. And we can transfer our successful experiences like we have done with Ciclovías programs that are a promising program to promote physical activity in communities. So yeah, we have had a good experience.
Thank you so much. Now time to, if you put on the lights, I can see the people. The floor is open for questions. When you have a question, please identify yourself and also indicate to whom you would like to specifically address the question, or is it to the entire panel? So the floor is open, and I believe there are microphones at each row here.
I'm Tim Olds from Australia. I guess the question is addressed to the entire panel. It seems to me that in developed countries that there are two ways we can go. One is to try and wind back the clock to the 50s and 60s, and sometimes we do that. We make it difficult, for example, for people to drive their car, have school exclusion zones. We try to take televisions out of people's bedrooms, kids' bedrooms. But the other approach is just to say, look, the world's changed. We're in a new technological environment, and let's try to create new activity opportunities using that new environment. So things such as active video games, or a gym in many ways is a response to physical activity being taken out of everyday life. And I'm just interested in the panel's opinions as to which is the better way to go in developed countries.
If you don't mind, Tim, there was just a couple of people up on the panel who didn't quite hear that question. So Tim's question was really, there are two ways that we can go about this. One is we can try and turn back the clock, okay, and look at days gone by, so in the 1950s, and try to look at the way in which we lived then. The other way is to try to take a modernised approach and try to, for example, use the electronic devices, active video games, and try to create new solutions to this physical inactivity crisis. What are our opinions on the ways in which we should go? Try and wind back the clock, or try to stay consistent with what's happening nowadays?
Anybody want to take a crack at that? Do you want to go with the flow or just go to the back?
Well, I could try. I would turn back the clock. But we can't. So really, we're faced with a reality. In parts of my state, in Louisiana, in North Baton Rouge, it really isn't safe to go outside. We have a murder rate higher than Chicago. I don't know how many murders we're up to this year, but it's just not safe in some neighborhoods to go outside and play. I mean, there's a perception of safety, I understand that, but there really is a safety issue in some areas. So if the kids are going to be inside, and right now they're watching a lot of television, things like active gaming and these sorts of things are an option. However, we have a debate this afternoon about that topic, and I know people are very polarized on that issue, so we can tackle that then. But the fact that we've decentralized our school system and we're busing the kids to schools, that's a political reality in Louisiana and other places. There are no longer neighborhood schools. we'd have to go back and kind of reverse engineer all these neighborhoods. And we can do that when we can. But, you know, it's very difficult, and I really have no idea what I'm talking about, so.
Let's move on to another question here.
Yes, Dwayne Sheehan from Mount Royal University in Calgary. My question is for, well, for you, Dr. Malina, but also for anybody on the panel. I've heard some discussion about the possibility of having global measurements or consistent measurement tools, and I'd be curious to know what's percolating in each of your heads in terms of what you think that looks like and how close we are to actually being able to determine what those consistent measurements might be. Thank you.
I didn't fully understand. Say it again, more slowly.
The consistent measurements that we might be able to use globally. It's been mentioned a couple times today, and I'm curious to know what anybody's thinking those might look like and when they might be possible.
I think Mark Tremblay would be someone who is snowed under right now, so I'm not trying to put him on the spot, who'd be able to really inform this. After this global summit, there is a post-summit workshop with the countries who have put together the report cards that will certainly start that conversation. And it'll get us talking and trying to come up with, you know, we've got a core set of indicators at the moment, but trying to come up with the agreed metrics and then how we go about operationalising it. Now, it would be really good if we can come away with a global set of standardised metrics and questions, and it'll be certainly the first step. So I think this summit has sparked the conversation. We get an ability at the end of the summit to try to concretise some of that conversation. So I think we're certainly in a good spot, but hopefully at the end of the post-summit workshop, we'll be able to report a little more deeply on that.
I think that's one of the most important things of any global interaction is to begin the discussion. John.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I agree with what you said. So the discussion will start. I think the basic processes for producing grades are reasonably robust, and they make the grades quite comparable across countries. But I think it is difficult to imagine in the short term us having you know, consensus measurement methods. But maybe in the medium term, that's a reasonable goal. And another issue is sampling. So it's not just the measurement methods, but it's the sample. So in some countries, there's good surveillance with, you know, the measurement method is the best available, but the surveillance might be directed only at adolescents. For example, that's the case with some of the Scottish grades. So we don't survey preschool children. We have a gap there. So I think it's partly about standardizing surveillance, the populations, as well as possibly standardizing the measurement methods.
Who's next? Okay, please.
I'm Sandy Lavery. I'm from a rural community in British Columbia, Canada. And I'd like to know a little bit, maybe from each of the countries, about physical education and how that leads to physical activity. From a rural community, I see that children who are not being taught proper fundamental movement skills in school, elementary, primary, elementary, and even into middle school, are not really active by the time they're 13, 14 years of age. And I just want to know if that's maybe common or if there's any research done in any of the countries.
Who wants to start? I think you touched on the relationship between movement proficiency and physical activity. Silvia, would you like to start?
Okay. We have a hard situation in physical education in Colombian schools because in most of the public schools, in elementary schools, physical education is imparted by any professor, not personnel trained in physical activity. So usually the classes are not well designed to be or to include moderate and vigorous physical activity. They don't have enough time during the school day. We have really short school days that start at 7 a.m. and finish at 11 in the morning. So sometimes we have just half an hour of physical education. So we consider that is like the main scenario for our country to promote physical activity, the school. But we don't have, or we have to create opportunities to improve that scenario because of this safety that it refers to children. So it is not our best indicator right now, but it's the one that we must work more to provide good opportunities for children to be active.
Vincent.
Thank you. In Kenya, we have a government policy that children should be taken for physical education at least 100 minutes per week, but compliance varies from school to school. Secondly, there's a challenge in terms of putting more emphasis on examinable subjects, such that time that's allocated for physical education is used to teach examinable subjects. And thirdly, there is a perception that PE teachers are not well endowed intellectually. So even those who go to the university and they take 2 teaching subjects, say chemistry and physical education or maths and physical education, when they are finally posted to the schools and you meet them and you ask them, what is your subject? They'll start with maths. What is your subject? They say, my first subject is maths. Then PE is given, the back door. So we, as researchers in these areas, are committed to talking about physical education, physical activity, and we want to keep talking about it with prestige and happiness, because I think this is one of the best courses that I've ever learned.
Now, part of the situation may be the preparation of physical education teachers, because in many parts of the United States, the number of those who want to be teachers of physical education is going down. They're more interested in the health professions or related things. And that touches to me a very sensitive question. How many physical education teachers know how to teach movement skills? Very practical question. I'm not seeing very many who know how to teach a 4 or 5-year-old certain movement proficiency patterns we expect at those ages. Another question, please.
Yes, this is for the entire panel. My name is John Stradioto. I work with First Nations in Northern Ontario. And the question I want to relate to is, how can we leverage the public's mind in all of our countries to emphasize physical activity as one of the best solutions for mental health issues? If we have, Sarah Hughes is now writing in Canada for a mental health issue that she's promoting. If we have the average Canadian youth having the mental health status of anxiety that a patient in an institution had 20 years ago, is what I've been told, can we leverage the public mind towards the mental health benefits in a more precise and stronger messaging way?
John?
I mean, I agree. I think that's potentially useful to, to get the kind of leverage that you're, clearly recognize that we need. And it also relates partly to something which Peter, I think, raised earlier on about promoting physical activity as a way, potentially at least, of improving academic attainment and cognition. I think both those things are, there's reasonable evidence for both those. I worry slightly, and I'm not sure we've got time to really fully discuss this, I worry slightly about the strength and the quality of evidence that we have for both of those things. So I work a bit, for example, on physical activity in children and adolescents and its relationship to their cognition and educational attainment. And I have to worry slightly that maybe, maybe I'm doubtful just because I can that lets me keep writing grant applications to carry on that work. But I just wonder, is the evidence quite good enough at the moment for us to go out and make a case for physical activity and mental health? It probably is, or certainly physical activity is probably sufficiently related in childhood to adolescence and then to adulthood. And if those things are related in adulthood or adolescence, that's probably fine. But I just have a slight worry that the evidence might not quite be as good as we'd like it to be yet. And once you start unpacking it, people then start in schools, for example, then start saying, well, what will the benefit be? What's the dose response for physical activity and mental health? What's the dose response for physical activity and academic attainment? Then I get a bit uneasy. So I'm kind of sharing my unease with the audience. I'm just not quite sure how good the evidence has to be. I'm slightly skeptical about whether we're there yet. So I think potentially it's very useful. It may be better for mental health than for cognition and educational attainment, or it may be perfectly good already for cognition and educational attainment. I just have a few reservations.
I believe we are nearing our time limit. I've been given a warning. We should perhaps bring this to a halt. I would like to thank the panelists for your insights. I would like to thank the audience for your attentiveness and participation, and thank you for the opportunity to participate.